Hello, my name's Ian Harris from Search Laboratory, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about migrating from Adobe Analytics to Google Analytics 360. The webinar will last around 40 minutes. We'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then there will be some time at the end for questions. If you do have questions, please could you type them in the chat box. So you'll see the little panel on the right of your screen. There's a little chat panel. Please type your questions in there. We won't mention who you are or your company when you ask a question unless you specifically state that. So just please feel free to ask anything you want. And we are recording this webinar and we will send it out to you afterwards, so you don't need to take screen grabs or write notes furiously. So we'll crack on. Your speakers today is, first of all, myself, Ian Harris. I'm the CEO of Search Laboratory. So Search Laboratory are a Google Analytics 360 sales partner. So we're one of 6 UK 360 sales partners. So that's people that can sell you the big 360 package. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Steve Carrad from DMPG. Steve's the CEO, and DMPG are Adobe certified experts, so they are the top level in terms of Adobe Analytics. And you'll see in the case study that we go through later on how the two companies came together on a migration project that needed top expertise on both platforms to perform a migration at speed, and we're going to walk you through that later on. This is what we'll be going through. So first of all, Steve will be taking us through product positioning. So what's the difference between the products? What's the similarities between the products, and where do they aim? You know, what's the markets that they're looking at, and what differences are there? And then Steve will walk us through the process for migration, so the overall kind of general process that we would normally follow, and then I'll walk you through that case study that I mentioned earlier. So it's quite a special one. I'll tell you all about that when we come to it. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Steve, who will talk about the positioning of the products.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, so let's talk about the product positioning first, and then we'll get into some of the fundamental differences. So ultimately, these two products, whether we're talking about the Adobe Cloud or the Google Marketing Platform, they are positioned slightly differently, and the clue really is in some of the names of these things. So Adobe like to think of themselves as a complete marketing solution, right? So what they've got is they've actually got 3 different clouds. They've got the Analytics Cloud, Advertising Cloud, and Experience Cloud. And really their proposition is about how the 3 of those operate together. So within the Analytics Cloud, you have Adobe DTM and Launch, which is the tag management system, Adobe Analytics, and Adobe Audience Manager, ultimately to track all your data, sending all the data to the various different applications. Advertising is, as it sounds, it's an advertising platform, so allow you to run your paid media, paid search, retargeting, that kind of stuff. And then the Experience Cloud, there's quite a lot in here, and this is where we're sort of leading to some of the major differences in terms of positioning, is they have the content management system in the form of AEM, they've got Adobe Target from a positioning point of view, Campaign from, say, email and push notification, direct mail kind of messaging, and then there's a video platform in there as well. Now that is a little bit different to Google's offering. Google is much more focused on the marketing side, right? And that's probably not massively surprising, given that their pedigree is obviously in the advertising space, predominantly from paid search perspective. So what they have is they kind of break their marketing platform into 3 areas, which happens to be the same 3 areas as Adobe. But they are much more focused on, say, the advertising and advertising analytics piece of this than they are on the experience side. So from an analytics point of view, they've got very similar products. The one additional one they've got there is the survey tool, but otherwise it's pretty much the same from an analytics point of view. Advertising, pretty much the same. The slight difference there is that Google being a platform owner, there's some sort of tighter integrations as you might expect. But on the experience side, that's where you get the big difference. So Google is less focused on the experience side of things. I know they have Google Optimizer, which is getting more into personalization, but ultimately they are much more focused on the marketing, advertising, and marketing optimization side of things. So when thinking about, do you want to migrate from Adobe to Google, one of the biggest kind of questions you need to be asking yourselves are, are we looking at or are we considering really an experience analytics tool, or are we more focused on a marketing and advertising performance analytics tool? That will be one of the sort of key drivers of a decision for you. So getting into some of the nitty-gritty on this, if we have a look at the differences in data model, if you are going to migrate, there are some key considerations to make. Now, the first thing to point out, we'll talk about events and metrics and so forth, but the main thing to consider is that from an implementation perspective, the two tools, Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, are near identical, right? So they are event-based systems. They are capturing events, and they are capturing context with those events. So whether we're talking about page load, a registration form complete, a transaction, doesn't really matter. They're all events, and they're all events with context. Okay, so from a pure technical implementation point of view, they are near identical. They both have default context, so things like IP address, browser information, device information, and they allow custom context. So information about your customers, information about your products, information about the interactions that are occurring on your sites or apps. That is the custom information that's often most valuable, and both have a way of tracking that data. Where you get the differences is when that data is captured, when it is received by the end application, you get some differences in the way that data is processed, and that is something you need to consider if you are looking to do a migration between the two. So the first thing to point out is the difference in what Adobe Analytics call events and what Google Analytics call custom metrics. And it's quite easy, this one, because actually there is not a great deal of difference. Both have different event types in that you can track things like a counter event, so just incrementing a count of 1 each time. You can have a numeric event. From a Google perspective, that's the same thing, it's just an integer, so either an integer of 1 or more. And you can track currency information. So if you're tracking currency information, that's normally used for pricing information or transactional information when you're actually tracking revenue. The only other sort of small difference here is that Google Analytics has an event type for time, whereas Adobe Analytics doesn't, but the way that's handled in Adobe Analytics is from a calculated metric perspective. So the only real consideration you'll need to make when looking at, say, events in Adobe Analytics and thinking about how that maps to Google Analytics is the context of how important that particular event is. And the reason for that is that Adobe Analytics doesn't have what Google calls the event structure. So you might know from Google Analytics, they have something else that's confusingly called events, but ultimately that is a data model that allows you to send event data and the context specifically for that event at the same time, right? It's its own kind of framework. And you have a few different labels that you send with that: category, action, label, and value. Now, the reason why that's important is that from a tracking setup perspective, what we normally see with, say, Google Analytics is that people will track their key performance indicators into custom metrics, right? So that is the dedicated custom metrics bit where you have to predefine what that event is, right? You have to state that that is, say, a revenue event for a specific thing, or it's a registration, newsletter, product view, that kind of stuff. And those are normally designed as key performance indicators. The events, as far as Google Analytics is concerned, is a very convenient way of tracking additional events that are interesting to the business that aren't necessarily KPIs. So interactions of buttons or drop downs and that kind of sliders, for example. With Adobe Analytics, it is all just into events, and you have to decide essentially how you then structure those events from a reporting perspective, which ones are going to be the KPIs and which ones are going to be the secondary events. So it's just a little bit in terms of organization. Google Analytics also has the goal setup, not something that's directly available in Adobe Analytics, but it's something you can achieve via a different method through funnel analysis inside of their reporting area. The only other difference to sort of point out here is the way the calculated metrics work, in that they are much more sophisticated. In an Adobe Analytics point of view, you can do a lot more kind of formulas inside of your calculated metrics than you can inside of Google Analytics. However, what we've seen is that for 80–90% of instances, the setup for Google Analytics is perfectly sufficient. So in almost all cases, we can do a relatively simple migration between the two. In the exceptions, then you have a little workaround. It's normally not a big deal. Okay, let's move on to the context now. So we've been talking about the events. Let's move on to the context. And really what we're talking about here is the difference between custom conversion and custom dimensions. Now, Adobe Analytics users will know that there is a couple of different types of context. You can have an EVAR or a prop or a custom conversion or a custom traffic. Ultimately, in the latest versions of Adobe, there is such small differences between the two. I'm really only going to focus on the custom conversion on the EVARs for the purpose of this. If there are particular exceptions where you want to talk about props to us, that's fine. Drop it in the chat, or talk to us afterwards about how to deal with that. But what we're going to look at is the difference between custom conversion and custom dimensions. No major differences here. There's a slight difference in what you set up and sort of what things are called between the two systems. So in Adobe Analytics, they have everything inside of this custom conversion canvas that you can see here in my example of EVAR 7. And here what you do is you have to predefine what that context is going to be, and you also have a few more selections. You have things like allocation, expiration, and whether it's going to be a merchandising variable. The allocation and expiration options, you get most recent or original for Adobe Analytics, and then your expiration options are defined, obviously, how long that persists for. You do have quite a lot of options in there. So you have things like you can expire it on the hit, on the visit, at the user level, but you can also pick things like number of days. The point is here is that while on the Google Analytics side, you have a smaller set of options here, right? You can set the scope to hit, visit, user, or product level. Again, it's another one of these instances where actually in 90% of cases, probably actually more, the options that you get on the Google Analytics side are going to be sufficient. It's very rare that we find custom instances of EVARs that can't somehow be dealt with another way through a Google, what the options available to a Google Analytics 360 customer are. The only other sort of point to make here is that while custom conversion and custom dimensions are near identical, you do have this additional capability inside of an EVAR to set something called a merchandising variable. This is the equivalent of doing enhanced e-commerce for Google Analytics. So these merchandising events are always being bound to a product eventually. And that's really to allow things like product list impression tracking, product view tracking, actually doing conversion rate on a per product basis. So enhanced e-commerce is the equivalent of that inside of Google Analytics. It's just called a different thing and set up a different way. Another major difference is the way the visit count works. Visit count in Adobe generally persists. The only real rule where that kind of gets reset is if there's a period of inactivity for more than 30 minutes. You can adjust that 30-minute time period, although it's not simple to do because you have to get into the code to do it. With Google, you can define your session timeout actually in the admin panel, so you can have anything from 1 minute to 4 hours, as you can see here. And incidentally, that's why there is normally a 4-hour latency on the data inside of Google Analytics outside of the real-time data. It's because of the way the session handling works. The additional session difference is that Google Analytics will count new sessions overnight, and it will count new sessions if you have a change of referrer, excluding direct, of course. But what that will mean is if you're ever trying to do a comparison between the two, you've got, say, 2 parallel running, or you're trying to do a migration between Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics, you will never get the session data to match up because they fundamentally have different data models. The additional thing to bear in mind here is that the way the session data tracks is that Google always looks at the last value for a session in the context data. So thinking back to the previous slide here about custom conversion and custom dimensions and this allocation here, it's always by default looking at the most recent value, okay? So what that means is that at the end of the session, it will look at what the most recent value was and associate that for the entire session. Now that can be very, very useful and actually different to Adobe when considering how people's, say, state changed over over a session and being able to wrap up all those events to the accurate session if it did change during that session. With that in mind, there is a difference in the way, say, customer ID and user ID works as well. Now, this is a way of actually building up a profile of customers, so not devices, but actual customers. Adobe has a thing called customer ID, and you can see here there's various different kind of ways in which you can state whether that is a customer in authentication methods. It's a very similar kind of process for Google Analytics. The sort of main difference here is that Adobe Analytics isn't really doing it for the purpose of analytics and reporting. What it's doing is it's getting that profile or producing that profile to be able to share data between its Experience Cloud products. So being able to share the data between, say, analytics and the personalization tool. Google Analytics is providing much more capability to be able to understand reporting and say cross-device interaction within the analytics system. So you can get a better understanding a lot quicker about how people are behaving cross-device. And there is also now a new feature inside of Google Analytics, which is this sampled cross-device capability, which doesn't rely on user ID. So you can, even pre-user ID, get a sense of what's actually happening with your customers cross-device, which isn't natively available with Adobe Analytics. Okay, let's have a look at the analysis and insights. So what we've got here is marketing attribution and attribution IQ. Now, Google Analytics has always been known for having strong marketing channel attribution, so various different models that you can play with. Adobe recently launched Attribution IQ to allow you to do the same thing. They're pretty much the same models in here. There's slight differences in the models, but you can build your own custom model anyway. So from a marketing attribution perspective, pretty much the same. The only slight difference here is that because Adobe is doing it at the context level, right, the EVAR level, it isn't just restricted to marketing channel. You can do it on any EVAR. Again, it's another one of these sort of 80-20 rules in that actually for the most part, this is, you know, what customers are using it for. They're using it for the marketing attribution. So now actually this is pretty much parity between the two, and you should better do a nice switch between them. The only sort of consideration you'll probably need to make is the way the marketing channels work, in that there's a lot more that Google will do for you by default in terms of determining what your marketing channel is. There is a defined framework for sending data in to get the right marketing channel. With Adobe, it's a bit more open-ended, which in some ways is better because it gives you more flexibility. But actually what we tend to find is that this is one of the areas where one of the biggest confusion comes in, and there's a lot of kind of mistracked data in here and poorly represented or poorly classified information because it is so open-ended. So this one is actually a very interesting topic you might want to talk to us about in more detail after this session. Let's look at segmentation. Segmentation both have a segmentation canvas, which on the surface of it look pretty similar. Main differences here really are that the Adobe Analytics segment canvas is a bit more capable in terms of what it does. So primarily it has an additional scoping or container option, and you can define segments at the hit level. You can only define sessions at the visit or the visitor level inside of Google Analytics. That's not to say you can't do hit segmentation in Google Analytics, it's just that you do it a different way. You would do hit-based segmentation based by running dimensional reports and breaking down your data by your hit dimensions. So you can still achieve the same thing, it's just done a slightly different way. The other thing that's sort of a major difference here is in terms of the sequencing, in that there's a lot more flexibility and capability to determine sequences in here. So so you create rules to say sort of this, then that, and if this happened in certain sequences, there's a particular behavior pattern that we want to try and analyze. And this kind of goes back to the point I made originally about Adobe being much more focused on being that kind of experience analytics as opposed to marketing analytics, and therefore some of the insight capabilities are going to be greater, but at the kind of detriment of the simplicity and marketing integrations, advertising integrations. This is one of those examples where there is a bit more capability inside the Adobe Analytics tool. But again, if you're looking at this thinking, sort of considering your options and thinking, well, we don't necessarily make use of that kind of stuff, or we really are more of an advertising, marketing, analytics-driven business, then chances are that what you get in the segmentation capability in Google Analytics is going to be more than sufficient. Other analysis options. What we've got is Workspace inside of Adobe Analytics, which is a very popular tool, taken over from Ad Hoc Analytics. So it's a nice drag and drop interface, nice quick loading where you can come and visualize your data, break things down, drop segments on, that kind of stuff. Google Analytics are in the process, really. It's now in beta mode of launching their product called Analysis, which really is a competitor, I suppose, to Workspace. It's not as fully featured as a Workspace tool because it's a lot newer, but it's ultimately doing the same thing. You are picking items to drag and drop into a canvas area, you're building visualizations, you're building breakdowns of data. So there's kind of more capability in terms of things like segment stacking and some of the visualizations that you have inside of Adobe Analytics, but I'm pretty sure that within a year or so, Google Analytics will catch up. But for the most part, for the majority of the kind of analysis that you would be doing, if you are kind of more of a marketing focused business, the analysis tool is going to be sufficient for your needs. So moving on to extraction and ingestion, just bear in mind that some differences here, not a lot though. From an extraction point of view, in Adobe Analytics, you have kind of three main ways beyond just, say, exporting like a regular report. If you wanted to get large amounts of data out, you have three options here. You have something called Data Warehouse, where it's a bit like kind of like a SQL tool where you don't have to write SQL. You come and specify what your dimensions and metrics need to be at a time period. That kind of runs off in the background and then spits out a report that you can dump onto an FTP somewhere. It's all pre-processed data, right? So you can get the data model data like session counts and user counts, that kind of stuff. And the data feeds is where you get the raw event level data out. So it will give you every single, or can give you every single event and the context with those events. This does not have a data model associated with it. So the assumption is that when you take a data feed, that you'll be putting that probably into an S3 environment and then taking that out, possibly doing some manipulation with it and then visualizing it in another tool. And the event stream is really the same thing as data feed. It's just that it's a real-time version of this. So as soon as the event hits the Adobe service, it can be pinged off to a data storage location of your choice. So three options there. From a Google Analytics perspective, the first two are pretty much the same in terms of the way they work. So what you'd have is you'd have custom tables. You can build that inside the Analytics tool, and then you can use a reporting API to query that. So same kind of output that you would get from Data Warehouse. It is modeled data, so modeled using the Google data model, again, to give you things like session counts and user counts. Then you can also use BigQuery, which you'll have access to as part of your 360 license. If you want to go and query the tool, that is more where you will need kind of SQL knowledge, but ultimately it's the same kind of output as the data feeds. The only thing they don't have at this point in time is a real-time event stream. And in the rare instances that we do see that being needed, you would be looking at additional technology for that. So you might be considering something like a Telium event stream or possibly similar products from a tool like Insight. And for the most part, what we don't actually see people using these event streams, because what we normally see is additional tech in play with these analytics tools. So like personalization tools, for example, which are using the same data set to serve up experiences in real time rather than actually just taking the events out. Where we see sort of our clients using the data in their sort of data science team, it's normally where they'll be using BigQuery or data feeds, where they can get access to that data very in a very fresh environment, but it's just not exactly real time. And then from an ingestion point of view, what we've got here is we've got what Adobe called data connectors. Now these are essentially pre-packaged ways of using the data upload or data insertion API. So they have quite a few data connectors in here. So partners like Responses, for example, might have a data connector for Adobe. Slight difference here in that Google are much more, or have been much more selective about this. So I think the only data partner at this point in time is Salesforce in terms of getting data in an automated way, sort of a click and select way of managing the data upload and APIs to get the data into the system. So there is a lot of sort of many more options on the data connector side. What I would say though is that the data connectors, while there are a lot more options, invariably what we have found is that when trying to do custom integrations, the data connectors don't necessarily give you all the functionality you'd want to do the specific type of implementation. So often what will happen is that we'll resort to using the data upload or data insertion to get the data in the way we actually want to do it. And generally, outside of these partners or these data connectors, you have the same methods for getting data in. You have a data upload method, which is where you can get sort of CSV text file data into, perhaps enrich existing IDs. So, for example, enriching, say, product IDs with metadata, or you wanted to upload data about your customers into the systems using batch files, or you can use the data insertion API or measurement protocol. It's exactly the same thing. All it is really is an endpoint and a framework for sending events with context. So they both function in pretty much the same way. And that was really it on the differences from the platform. It's not dramatic, to be honest. And actually, when we think about migration, the bigger considerations you need to make really are around the actual organization itself and the process you're going to take to do the migration. And sort of the three areas that we often talk to customers about and give them sort of ideas to think about is, first of all, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, are you a marketing analytics or are you an experience analytics business? Is that what you demand, right? Looking at your requirements, looking at your users, are you primarily trying to drive marketing optimization, or are you primarily trying to drive experience optimization? And depending on which kind of camp you fall into, that's probably going to be one of your biggest decision points. The other thing to consider is what is the current state of the tool, right? So how much adoption is there? How much confidence is there? What we've often found is that when the customers are using Adobe Analytics, but they're perhaps not using the entire suite, they've got maybe a legacy implementation of Adobe Analytics, there can often be a lot of confusion around the actual implementation itself, exactly how it works, exactly what it gives. And actually, therefore, it gives the concept of migration gives the opportunity to draw a line under that, have a bit of a clean slate, and look to do it the kind of right way going forwards, and make it a lot easier for users to actually use this data. And then the other consideration to make is how you're going to ensure the adoption of the right tool, and how is it going to be implemented the right way. So if mistakes have been made in the past, how are you actually going to make sure that it gets implemented correctly the next time around when you do this migration? And what we've got is we've developed this 9-step migration method where we're going from requirements validation, through to some sort of technical auditing, where we look at mapping between the two. So we look at, right, if you've got EVAR set up in a certain way and props and events set up in a certain way in Adobe, what do you need to do inside of Google Analytics to get the same or better result? Then there's an implementation effort, which may require some use of a data layer to make sure you've got consistency. And then you kind of get that implementation sign off, analytics soft launch, where you're looking to parallel run the two tools, because you will have users that need to be comfortable in switching over to the new platform, to the new data model, and understanding any differences in the data, getting comfortable with the new reporting. And then often what we have is we have an adoption and ongoing support contract to make sure that the users are continually supported to get the most out of that data. Now that might be initially a set of training sessions, or it could just be an ongoing relationship, because analytics, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is never just done. It's a continual process, and it is continually improved. And this has worked very, very well for us. We've done a lot of migrations following this process. And what we want to talk about now is an example of how we've done that. So I'll pass back to Ian at this point.
So yeah, this is a case study that we're particularly proud of, and it's a joint project between ourselves, that's Search Laboratory, and DMPG. Unfortunately, we can't name it, but it's one of the big publishers. So they have lots of publications, newspapers largely, and they had two big reasons for migrating. So the first one, a bit of a practical one, but Adobe put the license fee up significantly at renewal. So there's a significant increase in the cost that they were facing, and they had around 5 weeks to pay up or go. So it was a kind of decision point they had to make. The other thing was, it was hard to get insights from Adobe due to the complexity of the implementation. So Steve mentioned this earlier, but the implementation had grown and grown, and they had around 300 dimensions being tracked. It was a bit of a legacy thing, so different people had been involved, and users across the business needing insights. It was just complicated, and this is an area where Google Analytics 360 excels. That's kind of surfacing data and that ease of use thing. So they decided to do it, bite the bullet and migrate, and by the time contracts were signed, they now had only 4 weeks to migrate. So that's not long for a big implementation like this. 50 publications, so almost like 50 businesses were being tracked through Adobe Analytics that needed to migrate across. So we needed a minimum value product, an MVP, to be defined. So in other words, what do we need as the bare essentials to go live? And then we can obviously build on that later. So what is the absolute minimum, and what's the data layer that we need to replicate? Because we need to, whatever data it was going into, whatever that kind of essential data that was going into Adobe Analytics, we've got to surface that and get that out into Google Analytics. A big consideration early on was the structure. So on the left, this box is the Google diagram for 360. So this is its structure. It has an organization in which you have accounts, and then within accounts you have properties, and within properties you have views. So I won't go into all of those, but on the right hand side we have our client, which has a group organization with lots of brands, which are newspapers or websites. Each of those has different, what they call platforms. So a platform might be the main website, it might be AMP pages, it might be an app. So they have apps where you can download the newspaper and read it offline, and they wanted to track all that information. It might be Facebook instant articles. And what kind of Google's recommendations around this, if you read the Google advice, the documentation says that really platforms should map onto properties, but in this particular instance we matched the brands. So we mapped all the brands onto properties, and then the platforms, we posted, any hits from each platform were then posted into that property, and then we could separate them back out again using views. And I won't go into the detail of this, but the main driver behind this is how you then roll up those properties and view them in single reports, in account level reports. So very, very important decision to get right early on, because unpicking this is quite significant. The result of all of this was that indeed we did achieve that MVP implementation in 3 weeks. I will say they got an extension from Adobe for 3 months to do a parallel run. So extensions are possible, even though they might you know, initially not be so keen on them, but they did get an extension. So we did the implementation, and Google Analytics 360 was live in 3 weeks. But we did have that chance to do the parallel run and then follow up with all the complexities. The challenge is what we learnt in all of this thing. The scale of the data collection was massive. There's so many platforms, like I said, you know, the apps, the website, all of this stuff, the Facebook stuff, over so many brands, over 50 brands. So testing all of this was huge. Also the user adoption. So they had lots of people within lots of brands that were used to reporting in a certain way, and we did training. So we implemented bespoke training that said, this is how you used to do it, this is what it will look like now. And obviously there's, you know, as you followed from what Steve was saying, things are different. You know, metrics are different. So it's getting used to the new way. Those 300 dimensions that I mentioned earlier in that bloated Adobe implementation were then cut down to 40 that the business really needed. So it really, you know, it kind of streamlined the implementation, and therefore kind of playing into this thing of ease of use and surfacing data to the people that need it. That's what Google are good at. You almost know how to use these products before you're an expert user. You can fumble your way around them. So yeah, we're really proud of that one, and it was a major success. So that's all we've got time for on the presentation. Just to remind you again, we have a couple of questions that have come in. Do please type any questions you've got into the chat box. So now's the time if you do have any questions. But let me try and get through the ones that we've got already. So firstly, someone has asked, we use other Adobe tools, so other tools in the stack, presumably. What are the challenges of unpicking Adobe Analytics from the rest of the stack? Can we continue in a multi-vendor environment? So Steve, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So if you are using several tools within the Adobe stack, one thing you have probably experienced if you are doing that is that while the products within the clouds are kind of integrated, the way in which they're integrated isn't necessarily the most seamless. So there's still quite a lot of data that's being passed around on the back end between these tools, because, you know, don't forget, a lot of these tools have been bought as opposed to built. So Target, for example, used to be Automatica. Audience Manager used to be Demdex. AEM used to be CQ5 or something. So there is still manual effort that goes on behind the scenes to integrate, even within that Adobe Cloud. So if you do want to keep some of the Adobe tools, but perhaps you want to use the analytics tool specifically for analytics, it is entirely possible to continue to do that, or even use Google tools and other tools such as Monetize or Optimize it as well from a personalization perspective. You just need to know kind of what is currently going on with those Adobe integrations, and therefore know the best way to replicate them, or even possibly do it better, right, with other tools that can do things in a more of a real-time automated fashion as well. So yeah, entirely possible.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. So the next question, when we're talking about migration, what historical levels of data and reporting is possible? So this is presumably we migrate from Adobe to Google 360. Can we then see year-on-year data looking back to when we didn't have the 360 tool, looking at Adobe data?
Yep, sure. The short answer is no, but the longer answer is that actually in every single migration that we've done, there have always been differences between old and new. Now that might be because of a legacy implementation. There are some aspects that are different because of different kind of data modeling, a different way in which the data is tracked. So actually, what we recommend is that any kind of year-on-year type analysis, you would only really want to do that if you are 100% confident on your historical data. And invariably what we tend to find is that will often only be kind of top level data, so not the detailed dimensional breakdown data. It might just be top level data around kind of user numbers, transaction numbers, and total revenue, let's say, things like that. And that will therefore be best done extracting some top level data out of the tools and then comparing that in visualization, systems. It could be as simple as Excel. You might be using things like Looker or Domo or Tableau, for example, to do your visualizations and share the information around the business. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to try and integrate huge amounts of data, huge amounts of events into another analytics tool and try and sort of map the old data modeling method onto the new data modeling method. There's always going to be differences, and for that matter, it's cost, right? Because every single hit or every single event of data costs you. So even if you're talking about historical stuff, even if you were able to put that inside of Google Analytics, you'd be talking about a very, very expensive way of trying to get a year-on-year view. So we don't recommend it. There's rarely any value in doing it, and actually the main thing that needs to be achieved can be done so via other methods anyway.
Probably worth mentioning as well, as part of 360, you get access to BigQuery, and it's a fantastic tool for plopping data into and very, very quickly manipulating it and getting results out. Like Steve says, you got to be careful that you're comparing apples with apples when you do stuff like that, but you do get access to BigQuery, and it's a great tool. Okay, I think we're about out of time. So thank you very, very much for attending. Big thanks to Steve as well from DMPG. If you would like any more information, then our contact details are on there, or you can email me directly, ian.harris@searchlaboratory.com. We hope you found that useful. Like I say, you will get a recording sent out to you afterwards. So once again, thanks for attending.
Thank you very much.